Welcome to Shamanic Voices, a profound journey into the heart of shamanism, led by a seasoned practitioner with over 40 years of experience and his journeyman. To all our current listeners, welcome back. And to our new ones, we hope you enjoy the journey. Join us every other Wednesday morning at 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, streaming on Spotify, Audible, Apple Podcasts, and all other major streaming platforms. We also have video podcast on YouTube. Please check it out if you are interested in putting a face to the voices. Join us as you listen on your way to work, while eating breakfast, wherever you may be, as we delve into the wisdom of the ancient world and learn how this can help you navigate your modern life. As a reminder, if you did not read the description, these will be explicit episodes sharing trauma, abuse, and more. These are not for the lighthearted, but at the same time can bring with them healing and understanding. Please listen to this series with that in mind. So sit back, relax, and join us on this journey.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. This is Georg Breckman speaking today again with Jayne in our continuing series here on Shamanic Voices, what we're calling the Noble Lives series, where we go into depth, kind of biographical sketches of persons who've fought the odds, faced overwhelming circumstances, and yet risen above it and done something with their lives and created meaning and purpose and focus and a sense of life satisfaction within those lives. And I can think of a few other better examples than Jayne, who is with us today. How are you doing today, Jayne?
Doing all right.
And what we will be focusing on today, I hope, after going through all of, well, not all, but say a lot of traumas yesterday, our last episode, we're going to look at what she's been doing to recover, overcome, adapt, and how do we put it? To take lemons and make lemonade out of them.
Yeah. Like I said, you said last time we focused on all the stress and the trauma, and this time I'm focusing on how I coped and what got me through it, and then also the healing I've experienced through all this turmoil. As I mentioned, I think I mentioned last time that I had invisible friends as a child, and sometimes they guided me and sometimes they showed me the future, and I still don't have much of an explanation for why, but I also mentioned that when I was 2 years old, my mother shook me violently, and it led to a near-death experience, and believe it or not, the near-death experience really gave me a lot of guidance throughout my life. So it was because of that I knew that there was another world out there that was more important. During the near-death experience, my soul left my body, and my mother had put me in my bed after she shook me, like she could just kind of pretend that I was taking a nap. So I looked down and saw my body lying on the bed, and I watched my skin turn gray. My mother came into the room to check on me. She could see that my skin was gray, and she knew that I had died. So she panicked and ran out of the room crying, just in complete denial of the situation, I guess. There was a spirit person who looked like a man made of light, and he came in to comfort me and help me with my transition and to take me to the other side. So he and I talked for a minute or two because I was a little disoriented. And then a stronger spirit came in with this more authoritative voice, and he said that it wasn't my time to die. He said that there were several generations of planning that had gone into place from my life. There was work to be done, and I was the only one who could do it. He mentioned that I had to grow up, I had to become a mother, and I had to have this child that would be important to something. And then he told this light man to heal my injuries, and he spoke very sternly. And he said, "Don't let it happen again." And then he left. So the light man apologized for having to put me back into my body. It felt like being locked into a cage, and then this excruciating pain returned. That was the pain of something in the back of my neck was broken or nerves pinched or something. I don't know what it was, but it came from the shaking. He did something to heal the back of my head and he said, that's all I can do for the moment. But the headache was still just off the charts. It was an awful lot of pain. So maybe an hour or so later, I got up and walked out to the kitchen. My mother saw me, and at first she kind of had the glazed look on her face. She wasn't sure whether I was real or not. And she reached out and touched me, and then she just said, oh, you just took a nap. So I didn't like that a whole lot, so I stomped my foot and whined, and she was just immediately ready to shake me again. She said, it was really nice not having you around. And so she was ready to do it again just to get control. So then my light friend reached out and touched her. She immediately changed her mind, and she said, what am I doing? She was out there begging God for a miracle, and turned around, and there I was. And she was more worried that she just didn't want to go to jail. She wasn't worried about me. But I avoided her for the rest of the day, which is hard to do when you're 2 years old. You know, she still had to change my diapers and feed me, and I wanted nothing to do with her. I had a terrible headache. When my dad got home, I tried to tell him what was going on, but I wasn't really speaking in complete sentences, so he didn't understand. It was years later when he and I talked about it, and he said, oh, he had no idea. But for the rest of my life, I thought of my mother as a monster that couldn't be trusted. That was actually my second near-death experience. At the age of 2, the first one happened when shortly after I was born, but I was in the hospital. And the first time I chose to come back. But I've always felt that having 2 near-death experiences at a young age opened me up psychically, and it helped me to cope with the stress of everything going on in my family. And it showed me that there was another reality that felt more important than this one. I had memories of past lives when I was young, so I knew that mothers weren't supposed to be chronically angry and violent, but I wasn't sure if I'd go for help. But I did find comfort in knowing that things weren't really right in the home where I was. I always had this kind of hope that somebody would come and fix it one day.
Well, when you mentioned a prior experience, even before the 2-year-old incident where you were shaken to death, what was that all about? What actually happened?
I was born early, and I was very, very small. I had trouble breathing, and I actually remember my own birth, and I think that's all because of all these other strange experiences. But I remember being in the hospital, having tubes in me, and I weighed about 3 pounds, and I stopped breathing again, and I had this sensation of kind of my soul leaving through the back of my head and going through some tube, and then it was just kind of opened up into this what looked like outer space with stars looking at me, except the stars were people. And I said, well, what happened? And a voice said, well, you're going to be here with us now. And I said, but I was supposed to go there. You said that I would have parents who would take care of me. I feel like I missed something. And then I said, I want to go back. And the voice said, well, if you want to go back, you better hurry up. And then I felt like someone turned on the vacuum cleaner. I got sucked back into my body, and all of a sudden the pain is back. And I was confused. And long story short, I figured out the breathing thing. I had to think about that. And once I figured that out, it was fine. But my main problem was that I had to think about breathing. It wasn't something that just happened on its own, and that's probably because I was born early and my brain wasn't fully developed. But I spent the first 2 months of my life in the hospital. In
an incubator?
Yeah, in a little incubator of neonatal intensive care. By the time I went home from the hospital, that would have been around the time I should have been born. So I was like a newborn baby at 2 months old. And my parents had pictures of me where my grandmother was holding me, and she was comparing her thumb to my ankle. My ankle was the same size as her thumb. And so I was pretty little, but my mom kept like a journal of all of my milestones. And she said by the time I was 9 months old, I was caught up with the other kids and things were okay after that. But it was a lot of stress for my parents. And so my mom was a little resentful about that when my sister was born, and she was born on time and didn't have any problems. And my mom always told me that I was so bad I couldn't even be born the right way. I said, well, I don't think that was my fault. But, she wanted so much control. Um, so from a young age, by the time I was 3 years old, I knew things weren't right at home. Because I just had this sense of knowing that mommies aren't supposed to be like that. They're not supposed to shake the kids. They're not supposed to be like that. But I didn't, I felt kind of trapped in the situation because there wasn't any place else to go. So it's just, you do what kids do. Kids are good at adapting and moving on.
It's remarkable that you had that much memory, for instance, that happened that early in life. Most people do not.
Well, I was in therapy, and then I'll get into that later. But there's a reason all the memories are there. Maybe 6 years after the second near-death experience, one of these, I called them my invisible friends. They finally came back to talk to me again. And one of them told me that day that when I grew up, I would have a blonde-haired, blue-eyed son, and he would be Catholic. And they told me what his name would be. I don't want to mention that because I did have that child, and he would probably appreciate his privacy. But they showed me what he would look like. When I was about 8 years old, I saw his face 20 years before he was born. And then they told me, go tell mom. So I ran into the kitchen and told my mom, hey, mom, when I grow up, I'm going to have this blonde-haired, blue-eyed child. She laughed at me, basically saying that's not going to happen. But 20 years later, when he was born, everything that I told her when I was 8 years old had come true. And she said, how did you know that when you were 8 years old? And I went, what? I'd totally forgotten about it. But she remembered. But little things like that throughout my life kind of led me to believe that maybe I was here for a reason. And I'm still not quite sure I understand the whole point of all that. But I felt like there was something out there in the spirit world that would guide me.
So what you got from these two spirits right after your near-death experience was that you were going to have this child, and he was the reason, or did they give you some overarching purpose that you were going to fulfill independent of that?
Really, they were just talking to each other. It was important that I grow up and have this child. It's not like there was anything in particular. I made up all kinds of stories in my head, like he was supposed to be something really important. And he's 28 years old today, and he's just living his life. I really don't know what the purpose could be, and I can speculate based on things that have happened in the past month, but I'll get to that later. When I was 10 years old, my grandfather died unexpectedly, and I had my first experience that I can think of where I spoke to someone who had died. Probably 10 to 15 minutes after he died, he came into my room and sat at the edge of my bed, and we had a talk. I understood that he was dead. Somehow it didn't bother me. He wanted to say goodbye, and he told me, and he said, tell grandma that I love her and I didn't mean to go. He had a stroke, and he really didn't know there was anything wrong. He had smoked a lot, and that apparently impacted his health. He told me, he said, this is my dad's dad. He said, be a good girl and do what your daddy tells you to do. And I said, you mean my mommy and my daddy? And he goes, well, do what your daddy tells you to do. I found out years later that my dad's parents did not like my mother at all. They knew something wasn't right at home, but they didn't have any idea how bad it was. So that was at about 5:30 in the morning. So he told me, go back to sleep, and he had to go on. And so a few hours later, alarm clocks went off, and I was in the kitchen eating my breakfast, and I said, Mommy, Grandpa died last night. And she said, "Oh, he did not eat your cereal." And I said, "Yes, he did." And I tried to tell her that I talked to him, and just then the phone rang with the news that my grandpa had died, and she never could understand how I knew things like that. But once in a while I would come to her and say, "Guess what, Mom? Here's what's going on in the world." And she would just tell me I was crazy because she couldn't begin to imagine where I had, and I still don't know completely where this information came from. But
So you were how old when the grandfather came again, please?
When my grandfather died, I was almost 10 years old.
Okay. And about how long did that encounter with him last? Any idea? Just a few minutes or what?
10 minutes.
Okay.
It's strange to go back and think about that. I didn't even question it. It didn't seem to be odd to me at all. I mean, as a child, I saw him. He was there. I knew who he was, and I understood where he was going. And it was interesting. I asked him if he talked to my sister, and he said, "No, she can't see me."
Did you actually saw him, eh?
Yeah, I'm not sure whether I could say I physically saw him, but I knew he was there, and I could see enough that it just didn't strike me as being odd at all.
Like you maybe recognized his voice, his presence?
Yeah, mostly what I saw was his face and his glasses, but as I remember it, he was just sitting on the edge of my bed talking to me. And I can't begin to imagine why that didn't strike me as odd, but I guess children don't really filter. With children, we accept things as they are.
That's true. Okay, please go on.
Well, a few months after that, it was when my mother started sexually abusing me and my sister. After the first incident, she liked to get kids in the shower with her. So after the first shower with my mom, she actually managed to get me and my sister in the shower with her. I hated myself. I hated my body. It was really very disturbing. And as I walked out of the bathroom, I heard a very kind female voice, and I don't know where it came from, but that voice said, "You don't have to allow her to touch you that way." And I said to the voice, "She's my mother. I can't say no to her." And the voice said, "Your body is yours. It's not hers. You can say no to her. All you have to do is say no." And I went, "Oh, really?" So a couple of days later, when my mom wanted to get back in the shower again, I said no. And that was not a pleasant conversation. But she manipulated, and she said, "Well, your sister and I will be in the shower together, and that'll be our special time." And I'm like, "Nope, I would rather be just about anywhere else." And
So
some
a
other
lot of us who have never been exposed to pedophiles and their ways would wonder, is that what they're mainly after? Just running their hands all over forbidden areas of the child's body? Is that their main thing? Or what do they get out of this?
Well,
I don't even
two in
understand.
pages. The first stage was to get to a point where she could look. And once you get comfortable with her looking at you, then she wants to touch. And she didn't get any farther than that with me because I started saying no. But with my sister, this went on for years. And if my mother had had her way, I believe she would have been doing daily pelvic exams. And it's about control, and it's about owning another person. And my mom did some really disturbing things, not just with my sister and me. I mean, this gets really disgusting, but when her mom died, her dad was lonely, and she stayed behind to be with her dad for a week or so after the funeral to just say to help him with his loneliness. And when my grandfather drove my mom back home to our house after that, and having sex with her own dad was just part of the routine. And she had to explain to him, "We can't do that now because the kids are here, my husband's here." And he said, "Well, what am I supposed to do?" And my dad found out, and he kind of made this face, and he goes, "Oh, you did what?" So, and my mom had really good drama. I mean, for her, I have never quite understood it, but she just had this thing where sex was something that made her feel important, and she wanted to own someone. And it's, just like anyone who does that kind of thing, they want to have
Now,
someone.
wait, she went back for a week after. Was it your maternal or paternal grandmother who died?
When her mother died.
When her mother died. So her own father? That's what I thought you just said. I just want to make sure I get this right in my mind. So she went back to comfort her own father, and this was no big deal with anybody else in the family? I mean, how many people knew about this?
Probably nobody, but my dad tends to not remember things like that, and I've never understood that either, but I don't think a lot of people know about it.
Yeah, I should think not. So she stays. I can understand staying with somebody after their world has been rocked to help look after them and all that, especially if they're old and fragile. But not for that reason.
If he was not, I wouldn't say he was old and fragile. He lived for about 25 years after that. My grandmother died relatively young because she had heart problems and other things going on then. But my grandfather was at a weak moment, and my mother seemed to enjoy that weak moment with him, that she could take advantage of her own dad. And she commented to me, I was only 12, but she commented to me that her father was better in bed than my father. And I said, I didn't quite understand what he was talking about. And I just went, what? And she's like, oh, never mind. It's like she had to say that. And
I guess she was telling you that, hoping you would follow in her footsteps. Of course, I'm very glad you did not. Yeah.
I feel like she was saying that it's more of a childish insecurity that she just had to let someone know. And because, some people are that way where they do something really bad and they have to tell someone because it just eats away at them until they do. But so I don't think she was hoping anything in particular for me. It was just what she felt like saying in the moment. And she said a lot of really odd things to me when I was a kid, especially around that age, because parents are supposed to talk to their kids about sex and things like that, but she never wanted to tell me anything. There's this belief that if I knew, then I would end up getting pregnant somehow. So she would tell me dirty jokes. And I mean, she had the mentality of a 10-year-old. So she would tell me dirty jokes that I didn't understand. And that was the extent of sex education with mom. And besides that, it was all like experiential with her. And I wanted nothing to do with that. So, that was just weird, and that's all I can say. I can't say that I understand her, but it was very strange. Let's see. Here's the next thing that happened when I was 12 years old, a healing kind of thing. I'll talk about part of it now and part of it later. One day I was just really tired of all the dysfunction at home, and I felt like I was just living in a hellhole. And so I walked out the door one day and decided I was leaving. I didn't know where I was going to go, so I walked down the street to a nearby park, and I sat at the park for 45 minutes or so, just thinking, I don't know, realistically I can't stay here, but I really don't want to go home. And so after I sat there for 45 minutes or so, I heard a voice tell me that everything would be better when I was older. And the voice seemed to come from an older version of myself. And I felt like there was a very kind man helping this older version of me to speak to my younger self. I wanted to have a longer conversation, but the presence only lasted a minute or two. My older self told me at that age that when I grew up, I would have a nice house to live in. I'd have a husband and children who grew up. And I remember the sense that this man told my older self to not tell me too much, but tell me enough that I would at least have something to hope for. And that was the impact it had on me. After that day, I believed that one day I could escape this hellhole of my life if I ever worked hard enough. And I spent years hoping that maybe my fairy godmother would come down and make things right. And that never really happened. But I had when things got really bad, I thought back on that day and said, okay, someday I'll find out how old I was. And like I said, I'll get into the other half of that later because you were the man who was helping my older self. And that's been something that's just been really fulfilling for me to at least know that there's, like I said, there's something out there that's beyond the physical. And that experience that day got me through an awful lot of turmoil. I never did understand where my invisible friends came from. I didn't know why they only showed up sporadically. And my mother would drag me to her Christian church every week, and where they told me that Jesus loved me and God would take care of me. And I was really resentful about that, and I felt betrayed. And I said, so how is God taking care of me when I have to go home to this monster of a mother? So at the age of 12, I flipped God off and decided I was atheist. I hated life. And I was just angry and resentful most of the time, but always hoping that maybe someday, somehow, it could get better. So when I was about 15 years old, I had a new Sunday school teacher who inspired me, and he seemed really happy, and I wanted to have some of this magic faith that he had. And I asked him how I could have that. He encouraged me to pray, and I said, I don't know what I'm praying to. And so I tried it, nothing happened. So he said, try it again. And so the second time I tried it, I really focused on the Lord's Prayer because that's all I knew. And I just really meditated on every word. And I felt like a new person afterwards. I started seeing the whole world from a new perspective. And I realized after that I was creating my life with my own choices. So I felt a little bit empowered, so that once again, there's a little bit of hope. So the next day after that, I could see the dysfunctional patterns in my family, and I could see how I was contributing to them. So I chose to just stop. I visualized it like being on this chaotic merry-go-round, and I just stepped off. And so everyone in my family kept doing the things they had always done, and I just walked away and didn't take part in it.
At what age did that incident occur where you were made immobile and people around you couldn't push you, couldn't move you at all, and some being had basically taken your consciousness out of your body and it appeared in a tree? You thought it might be a bird or something like that.
Oh, that's when I was 16. That happened twice. That time when I was 8 years old and somebody came to tell me about my son. I was immobile for a while, and my mom tried pushing me, and that was just all part of that day, and I didn't understand why. But then that happened a second time when I was about 16. And so let's see, where was I? Oh yeah, my family continued to do the things they had always done. I just chose not to take part in it. And, my mom tried to claim that I was still doing all the things I'd ever done before, and I just walked away. But I feel like that kind of, you could think of it as a Christian conversion experience or whatever, but I was more open to psychic experiences because I felt like there was some kind of guidance out there somewhere. And so I did have an experience when I was 16 years old. I was at a youth church camp, and I was really drawn to spend some time alone. So, I skipped all the whatever they were doing late at night. And at the time I was used to not really eating every day anyway. So, I just went off by myself, and I just somehow felt like I needed to focus. And so the next morning I looked up and I saw what looked like a bird in the sky, and it was just this little light that came down, and the light said to me, do not be afraid. And I was hoping it was some kind of alien who was going to take me off the planet because life at home was pretty bad. And my body I felt like these almost energetic roots come down from my feet, and it almost seemed to join to the center of the earth. And I was just completely frozen like a statue. And so other people from my church were there, and tried to push me and move me, and they couldn't. I weighed maybe 100 pounds, and they couldn't move me.
Now, were you standing somewhere when this happened, or in your bunk, or where?
I was standing in the parking lot by then.
Wow.
And the light being that I saw had a message, said that I was supposed to give a message to a man who was there, and this message was supposed to save his life. And I was never able to actually deliver the message, but the message was for a man named Rich Mullins. He was a Christian musician who was just starting off at the time, and the message was Firestone is bad, Goodyear is good, and they gave me the date of September 19th, 1997, and then I saw this vision of a car accident. Now, I didn't know at the time that Firestone and Goodyear were brand names of tires, and so I tried to give the message to people, and this voice that I was hearing was telling me things that nobody else would know. And so one of his other band members came to talk to me, and he said his name was Beaker. And I said, your mother calls you David. And he said, nobody knows that. And I said, I'm looking for a man whose mother calls him Wayne. Well, Rich Mullins, his mother called him Wayne because I think he had an uncle named Rich. But, I didn't know that at the time. I just had this voice telling me that, and it was supposed to get their attention. So I was able to give the message to the guy they called Beaker, and I don't know if he was able to relay that message. But years later, on that date, September 19th, 1997, Rich Mullins was in a single car accident, and that was around the time, it was just before the whole Firestone tire controversy came up, where Firestone was making bad tires, and the bean counters said it's fine, but a lot of people died because tires would split when people were driving down the road. And I don't know that information was ever recorded or made public in any way, but I think back on that day, sometime in the mid-'80s, I guess it was 11 years before his death actually happened, that I saw it psychically. And that kind of thing plagued me for a long time. I would have experiences like that where I would see things before they happened. Sometimes I would meet people for the first time and immediately see that they had less than 6 months to live, or I would see how they died, but I couldn't do anything about it, and nobody believed me. So for the most part, I kept that information to myself because it sounded crazy. And last time that happened was a year ago. And once again, I kept the information to myself, and the person, when I saw their death, they died exactly the way I saw it several months ahead of time, and there was nothing anyone could have done. And I don't know why I see those things. Sometimes the voice that comes to tell me that just has a sense of mischief with it, but it happens, and I still have no explanation for that.
So how old were you the first time that you had a knowing, I won't even call it necessarily seeing, but a knowing that someone was going to die, and it turned out to be accurate?
I think that's when I was 16. That was the first time that happened. And I have like a 63-page journal of other times when that kind of thing happened. And it doesn't happen every year, but when it happens, it always catches me off guard. And I'm like, oh, not again. I don't know what I'm supposed to do about it. And I've come to the conclusion that I don't necessarily have to do anything about it. Sometimes it's death. Sometimes it's just unbelievably trivial events that mean nothing, but I'll see things sometimes before they happen, and I'm like, okay, what was that for? And my dad used to joke with me. He goes, well, next time you talk to Jesus, why don't you get next week's lottery numbers? I said, it'd be really nice if it worked that way, but it just doesn't. They don't tell me that kind of thing. And I really don't know why. I don't know what the point is. Let's see. So a few years later, I was in college. My parents were divorced by then, and I was living with my dad. As I mentioned in the last podcast, I had developed amnesia. So by the time I was 18 and a half years old, I had no memory of high school or my mother or anything that happened my whole life. So I went through a couple of months where I just lived from day to day with no memory of my childhood. And that was kind of like a vacation that I needed after all the turmoil going on with my mother. That last year living with her was just terrible. So I heard one voice that said, go to the counseling center. There was this set of therapists on campus for students. And as I approached the counseling center, I heard another voice that screamed, you can't go in there, they'll kill you. And so I had these voices in my head screaming at me all the time. And one would say to do this, the other would say, don't do it. So I walked around feeling I was just filled with anxiety all the time. So I struggled every day focusing on my homework, just trying to get through the day, hoping that maybe somehow things would get better eventually. Once in a while, I would hear a voice that said it was here to help me. I didn't know where it came from, so I just didn't listen. And after several months of that, the voice came to me and said, while I was in my room doing my homework, and the voice said, put your pencil down. It's time to remember. And then memories started coming back to me, childhood memories that had been turned off for several months or a year. I'm not sure how long it was. And that prompted me to go to the counseling center and make an appointment to see a therapist. So I met with a psychologist 3 times a week for 2.5 years, where I told this guy every detail of my childhood, and he kind of guided me through recovering my childhood memories. And part of that was the memory of the near-death experience when I was 2. And I told him at the time, I don't know what that was. And he asked me if I had ever heard of a near-death experience, and I didn't understand that. So I was able to describe to him what happened on the other side. I could tell him what it felt like to be a newborn baby. I described to him my birth. And he only half believed me. But I think it was important for me to have somebody listen. So years ago on, I met my husband and we got married. I continued to see things that didn't really make sense. Sometimes I saw death coming for a person when it didn't make sense for me to know that. Mostly I tried to just kind of ignore it and move on with my life, because you can't really tell people stuff like that. And not even if I could, I don't think it would be helpful, because it would just leave the person paranoid. They can't really change it. If it's going to happen, it's going to happen. And so after we were married for a few years, we were ready to have children. And when I became pregnant with my first child, I saw one of those light beings come back. And this light being was guiding 2 little souls that he put inside of me. And I said, whoa, I have twins? So I was pregnant with twins the first time. And then the light being told me that one twin would die at a very young age and the other one would have disabilities. And I miscarried the first child 6 weeks into the pregnancy. And the second child was eventually diagnosed with autism. And this was the child that I saw when I was 8 years old.
So the light being came to you while you were in early stages of pregnancy, right?
Yeah, that was too early to pass a pregnancy test. So this was like day 1.
Wow.
So I knew, and then I had to wait a couple of weeks to take the pregnancy test to see if that came back positive. So I would say that babies are granted souls day 1 of gestation. It's not like the day after they're born or whatever people think when they love abortion. When a child is aborted, it murders a baby. The baby is alive and has a soul from the first day. Because the same thing happened with my second child, and I told my husband, I'm pregnant, and in a couple of weeks, maybe I can pass the pregnancy test. And he went, oh, how long have you known that? I said, just now. I just saw his soul. So that was an interesting experience. The day my first child was born, my mother commented that he had blonde hair and blue eyes, and we were Catholic. And we planned to give him the same name that I had mentioned when I was 8 years old. She remembered all that, but I had forgotten. And she said, how did you know that when you were 8 years old? And I said, what? Oh, I guess I did. I don't know, Mom. And then on my son's first birthday, his face looked exactly like the face that I had seen when I was 8 years old. And I went, oh, wow, how did I know that? And so when my second child came along, I had a similar experience. It was a lot less intense, but I saw his soul and I knew about the pregnancy day one. I never had to question. Mostly I thought I was half crazy. Over the years, I saw house fires before they happened. Not my house. My house never burned, but I'd see other people's house fires, car accidents, death, and a couple of times I tried to warn people about their house that was about to burn, and they didn't pay any attention to me until after it happened. And of course, then I learned pretty quickly that I could get accused of starting the fire, so I better just keep my mouth shut. I would just say to someone, hey, be careful about those candles that you're planning to burn in the basement, or, you might want to unplug that answering machine that's squirted out in your basement, and I'll just say it once and let it go, because if they're not going to listen, it's going to happen anyway. So I had a lot of turmoil about that, wondering, was I supposed to do something about that? Or, how can I know this? I don't know how I know it. If there's anything I can do to turn it on, turn it off, I don't know. But that was not, I would not call it necessarily comforting. But
these were all familial or very local sort of events. Did you ever have these premonitions when it came to larger events, like some sort of foreshadowing of 911, that sort of thing?
Actually, the day before September 11th, I remember September 10th, I heard a voice say, today is the last day. And I said, the last day of what? And the voice said, the last day of what you think is normal. Everything changes after this.
Well, that was correct.
Yeah, and I didn't know what it was about. I didn't have any idea. I couldn't have done anything about it. But I just hear this voice that says, by the way, tomorrow everything's going to be different. And I think I do have to say, where Americans are more aware of terrorism since then, and the world is really not the place that we thought it was. September 10th, 2001. So I guess that came to be true. It's just
well, prior to that time, you could visit your local courthouse without having to be examined, groped, or x-rayed on your way in. So yes, things did change.
Yeah, they did change quite a bit. Also, shortly after that, my first son was diagnosed with autism. Doctors said there was no hope for him. They said he would never go to high school. He'll never have meaningful friendships. The autism was severe enough that they said that he would just be a lifelong disabled child. And by the time he got to high school, if not sooner, he would be institutionalized. And we talked to several different pediatric neuropsychologists who said pretty much the same thing, but I'm a determined person. And so I thought, well, if that's his future, I have nothing to lose by trying. So I studied, and I realized that conventional medicine was not going to help. So I took craniosacral therapy from the Upledger Institute. And I learned about special diets, and my goal was to try any kind of therapy that wouldn't do any harm and that had a chance of doing something good. And throughout all of that, I learned to follow my intuition a little bit better, and I had even more strange experiences, but a lot of them were related to my son. I could put my hands on my son, feel the energy, know what to do, and then I took another class that would tell me, will put a label on what I was doing. So I was learning things before I took the class, and I said, okay, I'll just go with that, because over time, my son improved while, other people's kids didn't get better. And long story short, after more than 10 years of intense daily therapy, my son had a complete recovery. He's no longer autistic. And he right now, he has a job, he has a car, he has his own house, and he's living pretty much a normal life. But after the craniosacral therapy classes, I paid more attention to the psychic experiences because I had some kind of structure for them. I developed the ability to communicate with people who had recently died. And so sometimes I gave messages to their families that's not always welcome in a Catholic environment. So I felt like I had to be careful to keep from getting burned as a witch or whatever they're going to done. But once in a while, people were really grateful to be able to hear from, a family member who had recently died, and I could say, hey, they're okay. They're on the other side. Especially in a Catholic world where people are taught that you go to hell, you go to purgatory or whatever. It's like, well, that stuff isn't really what the church says it is. So, more than 15 years later, I left the Catholic Church and joined a spiritualist church where I officially learned mediumship. I met a lift-on therapist who helped me to get through a whole lot more healing. There's a website that describes what lift-on therapy is. LIFT is an acronym for Life Improvement Internal Focus Technique. And if you look up LIFT with 2 I's, LIIFT, you can read more about that. But I did lift-on therapy for more than 2 years to basically reprogram my thought processes so I could believe that, I can allow myself to believe that healing is possible and that even I could heal. And I thought I had achieved as much healing as I ever possibly could by 2021. And then I met Jorg. My first meeting with him was interesting. It was a phone call. There was someone we both met, introduced us. And so he knew nothing about me. He introduced himself and asked me, and just within 5 seconds, he said, your left knee has been hurting. And I said, well, not really. And he said, well, but it was hurting. And I said, well, yeah, I was kind of doubled over in pain and it was paralyzing. And he said, well, that counts. And he said, well, 8 years ago, a young man kicked you and broke your kneecap. And I counted, and I'm like, yeah, that was my son, who was 18 at the time. And he was upset about his video games, and he kicked me and broke my kneecap. And that's just the way it was at the time. I didn't think much of it. And so then Jorg asked me, he said, would you like to fix your knee? And I didn't really believe he could do it, but I said, sure, And so my knee felt tingly, and then I felt kind of a clump when it adjusted. That was 3 years ago, and my knee has not bothered me since then. A day earlier, I'd been in so much pain, I was doubled over and holding my breath, and it has not hurt since then at all. I have a few more healing experiences with Greg where I felt like I felt like I had to get to know him better after that. So thank you for that. Shortly after I met him, my mother died. And after I had a full 15 minutes of grieving the loss that I would never have a normal mother. And then a few months later, I met Jorg in person, and he took me through a healing meditation where he called in my mother, gave her a box, and we could both see her. And he instructed me to give her back all of the stuff that she had dumped on me my entire life. My mother was not happy to receive a box full of garbage that she had dumped on me over the years. But this took a good 45 minutes of just all of the stuff that she had, her expectations and her blaming me for everything that went wrong, and it was back in her box. She spent several months sifting through her box of nastiness, and because I'm a medium and I have friends who are mediums, she could stop by to register her complaints regularly. So after her death, she didn't change a whole lot. It was kind of interesting that after a few months of going through her box, that during mediumship class one day, she came in and she was sitting in the casket watching her body decompose. She didn't want to come out. So I just said, well, Mom, that's where you want to be. That's where you can be. So after the box exercise, Jorg asked me to speak to my 12-year-old self and tell her that things would be okay. And that communication only lasted for a minute or two. And then I said, hey, I remember this from when I was 12. I've written about it. And that's what I mentioned earlier in this podcast when at the age of 12, when I was at the park, I mean, it was my older self of this current age, right after my mother died, when I was able to speak to my younger self. And it just seemed really fulfilling to see that on both sides. I remember it from when I was 12, and then I saw the other side of it from being in my 50s.
Isn't it interesting how retrocausality works? And you have to ask yourself, isn't it probable that you hadn't written that passage in your journal about that encounter with your older self until after that event, which we did in our pagan therapy, took place?
I wrote about it before.
No, that's my point, is retrocausality. Since it didn't actually happen until we made it happen, this means that you couldn't have written about it until it had occurred. You couldn't have known it occurred until it occurred. But when it occurred, it retroactively went back and rewrote your personal history, including your diary, your journal, such that now it had happened. Prior to that day when we did it, had you looked at your journal, it would not have been there.
I remembered it through the years, and it meant a lot to me. So
but you would not now remember, or then have remembering it through the years until the day that it happened. That's what I mean by retrocausality. It's a pretty deep rabbit hole.
Yeah, that's a rabbit hole that I'm not sure I'm not sure I'm explaining that, but
actually, Clyde Lewis speaks about retrocausality, and that always made sense to me when he did.
It was cool, I'll just say that. And it was finally good for me to meet the man that I sensed was there when I was 12 years old. I'm like, there you are. Let's see, that like I said, that moment meant a lot to me growing up. I always had it gave me a sense of hope that I desperately needed.
Well, as you go through all of this, I think our listeners are probably going, well, they have different ideas about what happens in the afterlife. Like one of them is that, well, the best version of yourself is what's going to be there, because quite often when people meet a deceased uncle or grandfather or grandmother, whatever, they look not like you remember they're looking just before death. They look years younger, healthier, vibrant, and all that.
Yeah.
And so we think that a better version comes through, but in some people's case, if they died and there were sour grapes, there's still sour grapes on the other side, right?
Yeah.
That seems to have been your experience with your mom.
Yeah, and other people. Well, my uncle died a few years ago, and in life he was an alcoholic, but if you take away the alcohol, he was a really nice guy. And after he died, when I spoke to him and when other mediums spoke to him, he came across as this very kind, loving father, which is who he was outside of the alcohol. And he eventually came through and said, yeah, I drank too much. And well, he had some childhood traumas that he never really recovered from, and that's probably what drove him to drink. But he's got stuff to work through, just like we all do. He was not a bad person, but he just he did bad things because he drank, and the alcohol led him to do things that he wouldn't do otherwise. Let's see. It is interesting how most people, when they die, I think if it's like 15 minutes after they die, they come through looking the way they currently look because that's how they identify. But then after they've been on the other side for a few months, they tend to come back around age 30, when they're prime, because that's how they want to remember themselves. They can appear to you any way they want to, I think, but usually they'll appear to you in a way that's meaningful. Like one of my friends at church, her son died when I think he was 16 or 17, but he came through one day last week as a 5-year-old because the message he wanted to give to her was one of innocence and fun, and so he came through at the age of 5. And I was able to give her his message, and she said, oh yeah, that's exactly what he was saying do. And
so as being a medium and practicing mediumship, greatly changed your view of the afterlife?
Yes, because growing up Christian, we're taught that if you're good, you go to heaven, and if you're bad, you go to hell, unless you're Catholic and you go to purgatory. And really, the afterlife really just is what it is. And whether someone whatever the person's experience is in the afterlife depends on who they are. I mean, my mother has put herself through hell because she insists on trying to control. And nobody sends her there. And in fact, but right after she died, she just spent about 12 hours running. And I stopped her. I said, Bob, you can't run from this. And I asked her to, I said, go find your parents. And they'd been there for a while. And I said, did you find your dad? And she goes, well, I don't really want to talk to him right now. I'm like, well, you don't. But if you find your parents, they can show you where you can go to move on. It's not going to help you to stick around here and keep bugging me and trying to get me to undo your death. I can't do that. There's nothing I can do to bring you back. Just you have to take responsibility for you. And so that was when she went off to the cemetery to go watch her body decompose. She was there for months. And well, that's what you want to do. I can't stop you. And so in life, she didn't want to take responsibility for what she did. And in death, it's no different. I mean, most people really don't change a whole lot when they die. If they were good people in life, they'll be good people on the other side. And if they weren't, then...
Well, doesn't that really give us a window for increased moral self-responsibility to realize that we are, as we are living in this side, we are creating to some extent what our experience is going to be like on the other side. So might as well get it right and be kind to others and create good memories and do good things so that that's what we'll fall into when we go to the other side, not a continuing ball of conflict and unresolved issues as she has apparently done.
Yeah. Well, whatever problems we have in this life, if it's caused by our thought processes, we take those with us when we die. So the difference is after you're on the other side, if you have some kind of internal conflict, you can't change it. I mean, here we can change it. We can say, I choose to get up tomorrow morning and get a job and do my best and whatever. But once you're on the other side, you just have this cloud hanging over your head, and you can't really do much about it until you incarnate again, because this is where it gets real. I've heard some people say you think of the spirit world as being almost like textbooks and learning, and then we come here, this is like a lab. This is where it gets real and we actually put it into practice. So if you can't do it here, you're not going to be able to do it theoretically on the other side and have a happier time. So no matter how hard life is on this side, the important thing is that we do the right thing for the right reason, think of the greater good in everything we do, and then when our time to leave, we're ready.
So be good to your lab partner, take good notes, and improve your procedures, right?
Yes, and be honest and make sure your life is filled with integrity, and the rest of it, it doesn't necessarily mean that circumstances are going to get better. I mean, I think about all the years I lived with my mother, but that was her choice to be that way. And it wasn't mine, but I was there. And I can take what I learned from that and use it to help other people. Or I could sit and feel sorry for myself, which would just make things get worse. But so I try to help other people when I can.
Well, excellent. Well, Jayne, thank you for episode number 2 and sharing your expanded insights and taking us into how this interrelated with experiences on the other side and with other dimensional beings. And what do you want to talk about next time?
I don't know. We could talk about all the extra dimensional beings.
All right, let's do that then. Well, I thank all of you who are joining us here for being our audience in this episode of Shamanic Voices, where we're talking about noble lives and Jayne's ongoing evolution. Remember, you can catch us on Apple Podcast, Spotify, all kinds of other places, basically most major platforms where you can get podcasts. And we are video live on YouTube. This particular series for Protecting Jayne's Anonymity will be without video, but most of our interviews will be video. Well, until next time, Jayne, go with the gods.
Go with the gods.
Thank you for joining us on Shamanic Voices. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, share, follow us on social media, tell your friends. Every click, every share helps us with this project as we try to share with the world the customs passed down in the ancient Scandinavian tradition for over 8,000 years. We hope you enjoyed our show. Please join us next time at 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time every other Wednesday. You can also check out our website, Teutonichealing.com. Check the description for a link where you can explore more about what it is that we do, contact us for a session, or send us your questions that have answered. We look forward to sharing the space with you soon. See you next time on Shamanic Voices. Go with the gods.